Hello everyone and welcome back to a compilation review, and in this video I'm going to review Strain, Crack and Break, music from the Nerds with Wound list Volume 2, Germany. The release of the second phase of this compilation was honestly one of my most highly anticipated releases ever since the immaculate and spectacular first part that I made a lengthy review about it, considering the greatest compilation of 2019. And I would actually consider the first part to be one of the greatest compilations I've heard of all time. While it's messy, it's a spectacular and forward-thinking collection of songs from French artists in the underground old school scene. All of those artists were part of the infamous Nerds with Wound list that was contained in the very first album of the group back in 1979, and would contain hundreds of different artists from all around the world that influenced the group and made this release possible. And looking back at some of those tracks that were chosen, you could definitely tell the similarities in some occasions. You had some really outlandish, avant-garde and bizarre stuff that were really ahead of their time, and France had a really interesting music industry, especially back in the day, with a whole sound of music concrete. Other than that, you have some other tracks that would go into some really bizarre psychedelic rock directions, and others that might feel somewhat safe and outdated in comparison, but the overall result for the most part made for an excellent release that was unlike anything else I've heard before. So this obviously made me super excited for a volume 2. And it took a long time to actually get to this point. Like, it's already almost been 2 years since the release of the first part, and I was constantly waiting and waiting, but this is it. Part 2 is here, with a collection of tracks from German bands. And it makes sense, considering that in the 70s, Germany actually had its own unique and experimental phase with the genre known as Krautrock. This term originated in Germany, and it's basically a much more avant-garde and experimental version of some of the usual psychedelic rock stuff that you would get in the 70s. The Germans really added their own flair in this sound, and it was a result for many different underground groups, which makes a bit of a sense how all of those groups influenced Nerds with Wound's first album, where you could definitely see a few krautrock elements, even if at the end of the day it just ended to a much bigger of a mess, making anything else that would come out at this point feel like child's play. Nerds with Wound's first album was definitely one of a kind experience. The thing though is that after this point, Nerds with Wound somewhat abandoned this krautrock sound. For many years, many of the releases would just be some really bizarre sound collage and music concrete elements. The time where you would see krautrock being presented in a Nerds with Wound album would be many years later, even I would say decades down the road. So here's the thing with the second compilation. I wouldn't expect this release to just be better or on par compared to the very first, because what the first release managed to achieve with the French artist was something quite exceptional. It was an amazing collection of tracks for the most part. It was extremely messy and really presented sounds and material that were pretty much ahead of their time. But it also probably has to do more with the fact that I'm more intrigued with the sound of music concrete and sound collage rather than just, krautrock material, which I can definitely enjoy krautrock. I found albums that I really enjoy out of the genre. However, for me, just like with some psychedelic rock material, it is a sound that it's hard for me to really find great material. Like, I'm really picky when it comes to releases that go into sounds like this. For the most part, some releases like this are not really my style, even when it comes to releases from bands that are really popular in the scene. So the thing with the volume 2 over here is that I feel it's quite inferior compared to its predecessor, and so I ended up being slightly, like really slightly disappointed with the results of this project, mainly because this one in particular, outside of a few occasions, didn't really manage to present me something really groundbreaking, and it's also a compilation that doesn't feel that much of a mess, in the sense that it doesn't have that much of variety to it. This compilation, in comparison with the first one, has a much more present identity, and it's much more apparent in which direction it wants to go. It mostly presents just the psychedelic and krautrock side of things. The very first one was a big mess. It had its krautrock elements, but it also had its music concrete, sound collage, and avant-garde jazz portions, and it made for a mess of many different artists coming together. And the second part also has fewer artists and fewer length time in comparison, but even with less material, this album has less variety to it, and it doesn't really pull that many punches, and in that sense, it is kinda disappointed. However, there are still some amazing moments over here, and for the most part I was quite pleased with the results. I think at the end of the day it really has to do with how hyped I was after being so amazed with the first compilation that I was just hoping with something somewhat similar, and I didn't really get it. I got a much more one-dimensional and predictable album with ideas that feel somewhat more outdated and not as extreme and outlandish. Even with that being said though, there are still some great moments over here, and it is worth checking out. The compilation honestly starts extremely strong with the track Output by Wolfgang Donner. This is a really messy song. It goes more into some avant-garde jazz themes at some occasions, and it's really extreme. It has many different layers of instrumentation to it, and it's pretty chaotic, and for what it does, it really gives a great impression of some eccentric material you would get at this period of time, and this is a really well done song in that regard. The compilation instantly changes its pace though, with the track The Executioner by My Solid Ground. This is a much safer approach by having a pretty much more standard approach on like psychedelic rock. You still can get some bizarre elements, but it doesn't really go that far compared to many other stuff that you would listen in psychedelic rock and krautrock at this point of time. Even with that being one of the safest occasions this compilation has to offer though, it's still a pretty solid song, and it actually ends up being one of my favorites in terms that it becomes one of the most memorable moments in this entire compilation. It is easy to sit through, and it actually has a pretty nice melody to it that the more I listen to it, the more it stands out, and this track actually ended up being a grower on me. It is a pretty good song, and for what it does, it is pretty chill and catchy, and I appreciate that. Then we get once again into the bizarre territory with the track Scorpion by Association PC. This is another one of those tracks, like with the very first one, that goes into some really chaotic avant-garde moments. For me, this track definitely has some excellent elements to it, especially when it comes to the performances. I don't really know if I would consider this one of the greatest moments this compilation has to offer, but it's still a pretty solid one, and I really enjoyed it. Then we have one of the lengthier moments of the compilation with the track Fritz Müller Drum by Fritz Müller. This is actually an artist that has been featured in a Nurse with Wound release many years later, in the 2010 release Errorus, a collection of errors, which I would consider to be one of the more intriguing releases Nurse with Wound did in the 2010s. It's definitely one of the better ones, considering that he didn't really do many great material at this period of time. It was at this moment where we wouldn't really hear that much from Nurse with Wound, but this was certainly one of the greatest pieces he had in this period of time. Fritz Müller's piece over here is actually one of the most bizarre ones you get in this entire compilation, in the sense that it goes much more into directions of like sound collage. It has a constant haunting and unsettling aura to it, with this dark ambience that drags for the majority of the song, and on top of that you have many different recordings being put together. Now, even with that being said, even if it has some really interesting elements to it, it does make for one of the most unique and eccentric moments in this entire project. I wouldn't consider this one of the greatest moments in this compilation, mainly because even for what it does, it's not really that much intriguing. There is not that much of an element of a surprise. It is not really that abstract. Many of the transitions from the recordings are pretty slow, and outside of the ambience, there is not really something else that would be that much intriguing. So it is a nice piece, but certainly not one of the greatest. Even in terms of field recordings and sound collage and music concrete from this period of time, I'm pretty sure that you can find many different pieces that are better than this. The next one we get is a track from Magma, which was one of those instances that I actually ended up being slightly disappointed with the results. I wasn't really that much of a fan of this track, it's so nice. I think that it starts pretty okay with some nice psychedelic rock elements and some nice experimentations, but the second half is this really shallow passage of ambience with little to no instrumentation to it, and it doesn't really have that much going on to it, and it drags really long, and it doesn't really present that much to the song. So for me, it was one of those instances that I wasn't really impressed with the compilation. After this point, we get some pretty short and eccentric tracks with Amma Sound and also Tomorrow's Guild. The Tomorrow's Guild one is actually pretty extreme at some occasions. It has some insane vocal ranges with some screams and overall a really bizarre mixing and usages of sounds and instrumentation. And then we get once again another kinda bland song, and the one that would consider it to be the safest moment out of this compilation. I'm talking about the track from Out of Focus, a track that in my opinion doesn't really showcase how Nerds with Wound were actually influenced by a track of this. For the most part, outside of a few experimentations with the instruments here and there, this is pretty much a quite basic psychedelic rock track that doesn't really do that much. So yeah, it was one of those tracks that I didn't really enjoy. Even in terms of psychedelic rock, it wasn't something all that exciting. I was like, okay, this is a pretty basic and decent song. So for me, it doesn't really fit with the rest of this compilation. With the final instances, we get the track from Brainstorm, Snakeskin Tango, which is another one of those really short tracks. In my opinion, I would like to see much more out of this song because it does present one of the most intriguing and one of the most unique ideas. It is a really bizarre and avant-garde piece that in my opinion could have been developed even further, but then we get the track Big City by Thirsty Moon, which is 8.5 minutes and it actually contains many great elements to it. It stays in one idea that basically drags for the entirety of the song. However, in this idea we get many different layers of instrumentation in multiple occasions, and it also progresses really nicely. As the track progresses and goes on, it can become a bit more messy and just present new and different sounds, making it definitely one of the most intriguing moments out of the album. The one thing that I would consider the weakest out of the song would be the vocals that you get almost halfway towards the song. In my opinion, this track could have worked even better if it was instrumental. The vocals do not really complement this song, but you only get them in a few occasions, so it's fine. I would still consider it to be one of the better moments in this compilation. This project ends with the lengthiest track out of this whole compilation, the track Trauma by Gomorrah, which goes for 13 minutes, and it's a massive, messy, avant-garde krautrock piece with many progressions, many different layers of instrumentation just coming together and being fused with free improvised elements. We also had another occasion similar to this with the very first compilation with a really lengthy track, but in my opinion Trauma over here doesn't work that amazingly. There were occasions where the track actually ended up dragging for longer than needed in my opinion, having elements and ideas that would become somewhat boring after a while, but it's still a pretty good song for what it does. So for me it actually kinda feels that they played it a bit safe with this release in particular, considering how many different exciting and amazing elements I found in the first compilation. I was hoping for more of the same, but I didn't really feel that I got it with this compilation in particular. Still, for what it does, it is a pretty intriguing compilation where you can find some pretty interesting underground German bands from the 70s. With that being said, I was hoping for a bit more variety, not tracks mainly focusing on just krautrock elements, and other than that, I don't know if we're ever going to get a part 3, but if that's going to be the case, I'm hoping that it's not going to be just 2 years later. I'm hoping that we're going to get it sooner than that. So I might not enjoy it as much compared to the first part, but it's still worth the wait. It's worth giving it a shot. I'm going to give Volume 2 right here a 7 plus out of 10. What's your opinion on this compilation? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.